Right, thank you, Ingrid. She's off for a drink. Anyway, yes, transcending the dark divide, evolution, being, and gender. I was briefly with David Brazier was at the breakfast table, and Ingrid and David, and was vaguely thinking of what the themes were over the weekend. Last year it was very much the theme of compassion, wasn't it? It was very strong last year. And perhaps this year it may be about linking areas together or exploring how we should link or how we shouldn't link, was what point David made, I think, David Brazier made. Different areas together. This is really an offering, an offering in the sense of looking at areas which in some ways it may seem disparate, somewhat disparate, and trying to link them together. So it's an offering, it's a tentative kind of exploration around the theme of evolution, being, and gender. I raised the gender area last year and the divine feminine, so Les was right, there was something in the air which he picked up on, I think. But also next year is the anniversary, isn't it? The 150th anniversary of Darwin's Origin of Species. So it seems timely to have a look at the whole area of evolution, biological evolution and also spiritual evolution. And what holds it together, I feel, is being. And I feel that a core offering from transpersonal psychology is that at the heart of our embodiment is a boundless, pure, clear, free, spacious and aware state of being beyond condition, person or identity. Various referred to as, you know, pure mind, the divine within, or whatever. I'm going to go quite quickly at the start, and I'll slow down a bit. So the theme of this presentation is to explore and understand the nature of the dualistic experience. It's how we divide our experience, and how we divide ourselves against ourselves. And how society does that to us, I think. And also, what is the role of our biology? We are embodied beings, we are primates. We live on the earth, and we have got a biological past. And I think that's really important to acknowledge that and integrate that. And I know certainly my feminist colleagues don't like evolutionary psychology at all because they don't understand it, frankly. If I'm blunt. They think it's all about rationalising why men should go around and have lots of sexual partners, which it's not. That's something entirely different. So, obviously there's lots of talk about the non-dual in transpersonal being. I'm very interested in being, and being beyond the conditioned ego. And particular reference to evolution and gender. Right. I do feel that what transpersonal psychology offers to the rest of psychology, along with a systematic body of knowledge which Les and Mike and David and others are working diligently to develop, and methods of inquiry, we saw that with Rosemary, which was a wonderful addition to the keynotes. And all the keynotes have been brilliant, I think, really interesting. I feel what we offer as a section, as a subject area, and we are within the British Psychological Society, is a mode of being. I really do think that's really important. It's how we are with people. How we are with people, what matters. And hopefully it leaves a positive impression. But also we can be very irritating, can't we? Yeah. If from this perspective, very, very irritating. I'm very irritating and being regularly demoted as a consequence. Well, maybe other reasons actually, but as a consequence. But transpersonal training and spiritual traditions often encourage that we're more than both our biological nature and our socially conditioned self and world. We are more than that, and I do feel that. Spiritual training involves relating to our physicality, and all the religions do that, don't they? Or most of them do, in order to transcend this aspect, our embodied aspect of our being, or to explore it or develop it, whatever. And there are various approaches, aren't there? You can work with the body, you can try and master the body, deny the body, and that's a whole area of understanding, and something which David Fontana, for example, will be very knowledgeable about. I like looking at old books, really, and earlier books. So it wasn't so much Meister Eckhart in the original. It was Erich Fromm and his excellent book, To Have or To Be, in the 1970s. And Meister Eckhart, writing in the 1260s, 1300s, people should not consider what they do, but what they are. On being good, not the number of kind things to be done. Emphasize rather the fundamentals on which your work rests. Erich Fromm, our being is the reality, the spirit which moves us, the character that impels our behaviour. Carrying on with this, being is life, activity, birth, renewal, outpouring, flowing out, productivity, is the opposite of ego-boundness and egotism. Being to Eckhart means to be active in the classic sense of the productive expression of one's powers, not in the modern sense of being busy. To my mind, there are some aspects here which suggest the divine feminine. Human freedom is restricted to the extent to which we are bound to possession, works, and lastly our own egos. Our human aim is to get rid of the fetters of ego-boundness, egocentricity, that is to say, the having mode of existence, in order to arrive at full being. When we hold on to them, to objects, they become chains that interfere with our freedom. They block our self-realization. So here we're talking about freedom to be, and I think that's the theme, really. It's freedom to be, freedom, spaciousness. Not being confined either with our biology, by our social conditioning, or whatever it is. Breaking through the mode of having is a condition for all genuine activity. In Eckhart's ethical system, the supreme virtue is a state of productive inner activity, for which the premise is the overcoming of all forms of ego-boundedness and craving. Anyway, for the ladies amongst you, where does the shopaholics amongst you, what do you think about Peruna? It's the being of my own spiritual teachers, really, that impresses me most. It's how they are. When I went to see the Dalai Lama in Nottingham, with a few folk who are here, it's how he is what is so important. Spiritual traditions have often regarded the body as something to control, and as we were saying, many strategies have been employed. I'm going to skip through some of these, because it's quite a lot. Anyway, there's a lot of talk about evolution, so I think it's quite good to go back to the origins, literally. Darwin said, I'll get past this quickly, but I think it's useful to have touch base with actually what Darwin did say. Natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being. All corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress towards perfection. That's from the Origin of Species itself in 1859, which suggests a kind of progression, doesn't it? But apparently he sort of changed his views on that. He says at the very last sentence of Origin of Species, that's the only time he ever uses the word evolved, is the very last word in the book. There is a grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved, which means unfolded in Victorian times, apparently. So this is the only mention of the word evolution by Darwin. The person who mentioned, this is your big mate, our big favourite, Richard Dawkins. Charles Darwin had a big idea, arguably the most powerful idea ever. Darwin's discovery of natural selection as a mechanism that could explain much evolutionary change is a major idea. And if you want an antidote to Dawkins, then, as David Fontana knows, I have to keep saying David Fontana because there's different Davids. The Dawkins Delusion by McGrath is an excellent work in that area. This might seem not very transpersonal, but just skipping through it. Reproductive success, it's a number of descendants an organism has which determines its contribution to the evolution of a species. It's actually reproduction is the crucial bit. So you could be a wonderful specimen, but if you don't reproduce biologically, it's lost. So that's an interesting thing to bear in mind. What I do agree with Dawkins and Darwin is that nature is read in tooth and claw, which is written by Tennyson, wasn't it? I didn't realise that. I always thought it was Hobbes. Anyway, it's Tennyson. And one of the recent reruns of Dawkins' programmes on evolution, because he had his background in Kenya, and Fraser Watts's information about his family background was really interesting, was that it showed you life at night in the Kenyan jungle, and it's horrible. It is unbelievably horrible. Everything's eating everything else. It is dreadful. It is absolutely, hideously awful. And that, to me, in my mind, is so much what the Buddha was saying 2,500. It's awful. The situation which we're in. And of course, we are insulated to a certain degree. But that basic, cycle, without any rest at all, of being eaten, chased, hiding, attacking, it's continuous. And when you see it, so we project. I remember one of the great lamas have influenced Rob and myself, Songren Rinpoche. He used to say we project our freedom onto animals. We look at a bird flying and we project, whereas basically they're scared, they're terrified. And so it's quite a good antidote. So I really appreciate that. It's so easy to romanticize and assume that it's all lovely because it looks lovely when we're in a good mood. Also, many offspring are produced in nature. We lose that as well. And Greg LaHood's presentation around birth, he's keen to come next year. It would be nice to him to come next year, on childbirth and pregnancy and attitudes to women and pregnancy and the role of men in different cultures. It reminds you just how dangerous giving birth is. And as I was dozing, I like dozing, I'm very good at it. I was imagining, this sort of savannah scene, this sort of prehistoric savannah scene. Imagine yourself being a woman on her own, about to give birth, and giving birth. And just imagine yourself in that situation. So that's what's happened, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And obviously most women aren't on their own. But imagine yourself at vulnerability and what would be happening to you as an animal species, if you like, and what you have to deal with. And this is what our background is. Whatever our models of reincarnation, that we kind of zoom in from here and there all over the place, our embodiment is as an animal species in this world at this time. It happens in a context. It's a favourite of feminist thought, isn't it, in qualitative methods, the emphasis on context. And that is our context. And one of the lamas I met some years ago, he said that he felt that many Westerners were not embodied. Their visual sense is so dominant that they kind of are somewhat disembodied. And I think, as many of the folk who are therapists here recognise the importance of embodiment in order to develop spiritually and transpersonally. And I think that's perhaps even more important than we realise. So many offspring in nature are produced, and often very few survive. Also, evolve and unfold. I'm going to have to zoom on. Herbert Spencer was the person who introduced the term evolution. Darwin used the term transmutation or descent modification rather than evolution. It suggests a slow, gradual change of one thing into another. Right, I'll get past this in a second. I might skip this one. Herbert Spencer was very keen on the whole idea of societies becoming more and more progressively evolved, elaborate, ornate. Hence, modern society was, by definition, I suppose, superior to more primitive societies. Darwin was far less convinced on this. After long reflection, I cannot avoid the conviction that no innate tendency to development exists. So he did think about that a lot, as he thought about everything a lot. So even more complex organisms may simply have had to be more complex in order to survive under the conditions at which they appeared in this world. So it's not necessarily part of a grand plan. It could be, of course. Who knows? Survival of the fittest was a term devised by Spencer, and Darwin was apparently reluctant to adopt it. Babcock's view. Survival is only a means to reproductive success. Again, reproductive success is what's critical in biological evolution. Now, one of my favourites, and perhaps a favourite David's, I don't know, is Alfred Wallace. And I just think he looks like a nice guy. He looks kind of, he loved women, apparently. It doesn't mean he appreciated female beauty. He also lived with tribes. He lived with tribes for several years in Indonesia and the Amazon. And as you know, or many of you will know, he came up with the same theory, or pretty well the same theory as Darwin at the same time, which forced or prompted Darwin to publish The Origin. And that's a very interesting story. But his take on reality was a very different one. And we're beginning to get a bit more closer to our world. As David knows far more than me, he became an advocate of spiritualism. David knows the full story, but I have to crack on. He became an advocate of spiritualism. And he had a belief, so this is the middle of the 1800s or, 1850s and 1890s or whatever. He advocated spiritualism and a belief in a non-material origin for higher mental faculties. Now, he lived in Indonesia, where there's orangutans wandering around. I took my little granddaughter for a 5-year-old birthday to Twycross Zoo, where there are orangutans and gorillas. Right, the gorillas were amazing because he sidled up to the glass and just kind of looked at everyone, taking it all in. Gosh, what a show! It's like the hitchhiker's view on which are the most intelligent life forms on the planet, dolphins or humans. Humans reckon they were the most intelligent because they invented New York, whereas dolphins, all they did was mess around in water and have a good time. Dolphins reckon they were the most intelligent life forms on the planet for precisely the same reasons. And what he couldn't understand was how are humans so different? If you're living in a world where there are tribes which have not seen anything from Europe or the so-called modern world, and there are these human-like beings, surviving side by side. Why are humans so different? And it's a really interesting question. It really is. And so he was convinced of a non-material origin of higher human faculties. He argued that neither natural selection nor a broad theory of evolution could explain the origin of sensate or conscious life. And Dalai Lama says the same thing in his book, The Universe, when he looks at quantum physics and modern genetics and so on. There's still no explanation from these models of how human consciousness comes into being. And if you read the books on Wallace, for example, you realise that the scientific societies in Britain were having these debates, 150 years ago, as Chris said the other day. We tend to think, because we're living now, we're kind of thinking of things for the first time. But the debates are taken very, very seriously. That, if we're honest, and this was said, by senior people in the 1850s, we cannot see, in Buddhist terms, a substantive or substantial cause for consciousness beginning within the physical body. That's one of the Buddhist logical contemplative analyses on how mind is begat by mind, basically, not by the body. Because every mind moment is preceded by a previous mind moment. And there's nothing, as far as we can tell, which shows us that the mind was generated by something physical. Right. So, but there's one view maybe, is evolution in a broad sense? So we'll get onto that broad sense in a second. Could it actually be a unifier? One thing I don't like about the modern world is how it fragments everything, which again is all about transcending divides. And I do think Wilbur, who have been really nice to this year, Wilbur is very good at debunking postmodernist thought. I've always thought it was nuts, basically. And it was something I felt that, there's truth in it, but I felt that Buddhism has addressed the dangers of moving into nihilism, a long, long time ago, Buddhist philosophy. Anyway, it's a view by a Dean of Harvard University in United States. Postmodernism swims or wallows in the fragmentary. Evolutionary theory provides a common language that can erase the distinctions between all the sciences and the humanities. It's an interesting thought. And what is enlightenment? There's still some flyers there if you're interested. That magazine produced, which reflects a lot of integral psychology ideas and related areas. They have done some features on evolution. So spirituality and evolution. I was really chuffed that I think it was Fraser Watts mentioned Desjardins. And he was someone who I read when I was at Liverpool University, which is part of the great great wellspring of modern thought. Desjardins and his book The Phenomenon of Man in particular. He's a Jesuit priest, paleontologist, who tried to link Christian theology with the theory of evolution. And he incurred the wrath of the Vatican, I think, in part. But he's an interesting person, and he introduced the idea of orthogenesis. So we've seen what the original Darwinian view of evolution is about. Now we're looking at how the idea of evolution now is being used in a more spiritual way. And this idea that we're all moving in the direction of a universal, higher, unified consciousness. What I like about people like Darwin is that, because he was very dyed-in-the-wool Christian, wasn't he? And I really admire people, and I say this to my feminist colleagues, are you prepared to jettison your views? Because you might be wrong. I once did an interview with a famous Lama in India, and he said, Sonam Rinpoche, I think, and he said, well, in Buddhism we're interested in reality. If science can teach us anything, then we want to know. We're interested in reality. And what I like about Darwin is that he's interested, on the basis of his experience, which again is a kind of subjective empiricism, which David and the person I'm going to come on to in a minute, a friend of his section, John Crook, subjective empiricism. It's about what do you find in actuality. Well, David, I guess, was referring to that in his own area, or his own experience of being a Buddhist practitioner. So in some ways that's a nice idea, but where is the evidence? So Darwin, didn't go into that area on the basis of his evidence, but it's a question of trying to find out what is, rather than just what you want to be, how we want things to be. But it may, of course, be true. The Omegan point was one idea there, or God, and it predated the Gaia hypothesis. Again, it's this idea that the whole of the earth is a sort of unified, conscious field. Right, spirituality and contemporary approaches which link with transpersonal evolution. There's Andrew Cohen, who's the editor of the What is Enlightenment magazine. His colleague and mentor, in a way, Ken Wilber. There's also, you come across more evolutionary Christianity perspectives. Obviously, there are these divides in the United States, presumably. But there are these attempts to try and link both as well. Oops. Now, someone I've always admired is John Crook, who is one of the founding fathers, in many ways, of transpersonal psychology in this country. I knew him because I used to be interested in ethology, natural history, when I was doing a PhD. And I knew him as someone who was in the jungles studying troops of baboons and primates. And then I realised, because I met him in a jacuzzi in California. I said, Dr. Crook, I presume. I sort of splashed in, unwelcomed. Yes. Yes, he with his pith helmet. And John Crook got very interested in meditation through doing that. He's a bit older. So he did national service, and I think he discovered meditation in Hong Kong, went through doing national service. He also did a lot of Gestalt therapy training and all that kind of thing, the human potential training in the 70s, which I did. But also he's an evolutionary biologist. He wrote what I think is a hugely acknowledged work, really, The Evolution of Human Consciousness. Also the American, who was one of the first proponents of the idea of left brain, right brain, Robert Ornstein. He wrote one of the very early books on psychology of meditation with Claudio Naranjo, who was a major influence on me. He introduced me to Tibetan Buddhism in Berkeley, in California, mid-70s, late 70s. And also Charles Darwin's Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, again, is a great work, a great psychological work, about helping us to this is all about helping us to understand ourselves. My own interest in ufology. John Crook, he was interested in what are the biological roots of the higher forms of human consciousness. Is there a connection between evolution and enlightenment? It's in the preface of his book. He describes very well, the evolutionary psychology ideas about the evolution of altruism and empathy, reciprocal behaviour, how that is integral in many ways to the survival and progression of a social primate species. You don't have to accept it, but it does make sense. It does make a certain amount of sense. And in other words, it gives a useful backdrop for understanding our embodiment. Now, an interesting idea of his, to my mind, is his view of the unconscious. He says, in terms of psychoanalytic terms, the unconscious is a nice idea, but doesn't necessarily explain very much, which I think was being touched on by Rob. Rob's experiences mirror my own, and I've asked exactly the same questions of traditional psychodynamic views of the unconscious. It never really made a lot of sense to me. But anyway, experientially. But this idea, again, imagine yourself being this woman giving birth in, Africa, out of Africa, kind of setting, and also you've got to try and feed that baby, and you've got to feed it from your breast milk. Now, if you've got, these little beings keep appearing, you don't necessarily understand how they keep appearing, but they keep appearing fairly regularly in your life. And of course, given the time lapse between conception and birth, obviously you can see how you could have all sorts of wonderful explanations about what might be going on. But basically, you have to look after this little one. Now, John Crook argues that maternal affection is not necessarily automatic. That if you're in those dire straits, your efforts are going to be directed more towards the one, the cuckoo kind of thing, the one which is more likely to survive in reality. So what Crook argues is that it could be a natural part of human nature that we shut things away as an infant. In other words, we learn to kind of behave. We learn to fit in with the mother. We learn to fit in with the mother. And therefore we suppress certain emotions. That's what the argument is. And he calls this, in order to adapt to the mother, in order for us to survive. And having seen I've got 3 little grandchildren now. Every year I come with another one. Who are 3 under the age of 5 or under. And you can see them as little primates, little organisms, trying desperately to survive, trying to make out. And when the ones get a little bit older, like my 5-year-old granddaughter, when she was 3, 4, 5, you see her desperately trying to make sense of the world and getting terrified when it doesn't fit in. Really terrified, the way children are terrified, in a way we're thankfully often not terrified. So you get this sense then that we have to regulate, we learn to regulate ourselves at a very early age. Right? Crack on, come on, faster. Right. Motivated by fear, that's an interesting one. Crook says that fear then is really deeply rooted in the human psyche. Is it? Wordsworth. Oh, I always loved that. Wordsworth.
We learn to regulate ourselves
So it generates an unconscious store of potentially threatening material. Another view, he argued, is that the way the brain is structured, we have two modes of self-consciousness. One is subjective, which is really about being in the moment. As you all know from mindfulness practice, for example. It's about being in the moment. And I think Crook argues that it's perhaps not that different to many aspects of animal consciousness, about just being in the present. And that state is generally quite positive. Whereas objective self-consciousness is because we're a social species, we are primed to compare ourselves with others. So again, could be very, very deeply rooted, and we know how much misery comparing ourselves with others generates, especially in modern society, especially for young women, young men, images of perfection and so on. An objective self-consciousness is often associated with anxiety, whereas subjective self-consciousness is often associated with being in the now. John Crook was also writing. It's interesting. He must have. His book was published in 1980, so presumably he was writing in the in the late 1970s. And he describes then how life was then. You forget. And this is a key thing about Ornstein's contribution. We do forget as humans, as a species. We do forget things. And objective self-consciousness is anxiety and prone, involving comparison with others. And life in modern society, according to Crook, who's coming to looking at modern society as a biologist, is something we're not biologically prepared for. It's a useful idea to have in mind, I feel. And the world then in the 70s was full of unemployment, alienation, despair and apathy. This is straight from John Crook's view. And then we got Mrs. Thatcher. Okay. You see, you don't remember. You don't remember. Was it the flashbacks? Everyone went quiet. So we're living in a world, according to his perspective, it's just an offering to think about, because you don't get a lot of it in the therapy world, I don't think, evolutionary psychology especially, or evolutionary perspectives. Anyway. Taking a dialectical approach, he argues, and as Crook towards the end of his book, that transpersonal approaches given, such as Zen training, which he's got a lot of experience in, Chinese training, meditation training. He's a master now, isn't he, teaching?
He is indeed.
Yeah. Right. It may help us to come to terms with the deep feelings of insecurity and loss and uncertainty in the modern world. So it's it's a very pragmatic take on how traditional transpersonal methods actually have a relevance to how life is in this modern world. And many of us, I'm very touched by people's comments, many of our appreciation of this society and our appreciation of David, Ingrid and Martin in founding the section, I should say, is that people often find a home here. I have for the last 12 years I've had a professional home for the first time in my life. So actually, you're not so much the mad monk now, but people are kind of more interested and more open about what goes on. Ornstein's take is slightly different. He wrote a dozen years after after Crook. The mind is a squadron of simpletons. It's not unified, it's not rational, it's not well designed, it's not even designed at all. Like the rest of biological evolution, a mind is a collage of adaptations to different situations. Things happen because they had to happen in order to survive. And we often don't see ourselves with that kind of humility. And he says, again, the finishing touches on our mind were complete tens of thousands of years ago. He says at the bottom there, we cannot make the right changes in ourselves in society without knowing or understanding where we come from. So it's about self-understanding here. For me, a key benefit from reading Ornstein is that he outlined how humans are primed through evolution to react to short-term changes. That's what we're geared to as a species. It's sudden threats. What we're not good at, which could be why, but make sense of how we are not aware of things like climate change subjectively. We're not aware of small, gradual changes in our environment. And it's been a principle which dictators have used throughout the centuries. A way in which governments bring in policies. You bring in a very little step, year after year. And because we, as a species, we adapt to the present moment, we lose track of where we've come from. And that can apply then to our own life. I mean, Dalai Lama says that, if you stick with a practice, then you may think, actually, nothing much is happening. My experience is sailing, very limited experience. It appears like nothing's happening. Or cricket at times. It appears like nothing's happening. But then, a couple of hours on, you realise the scoreboard's changed by about 200 runs. Or you find that you're several miles offshore. Because we're not aware of the changes. And I think that's a really interesting one. And particularly when it related to gender and, if I've got time. So social changes were not geared to long-term changes. I'll miss that bit for a moment. The human mind is the way it is because the world is the way it is. We're geared to fitting in with the world. That's what we're about as biological creatures. And one of my main teachers, Geshe Kelsang, said, the mind can adapt to anything given time. We can adapt to anything. We can get used to anything over time. Right then. Ornstein always likes to quote the Sufi Rumi in his books, and he mentions this one. New organs of perception come into being because of necessity. So necessitous one, increase your need. There will be no further biological evolution without conscious evolution. But the pace of change now is far too great for us to try and adapt unconsciously. This amazing brain we have is still something of a puzzle, I think, is my understanding of how it actually happened. There are different views. It puzzled Wallace, when he was living with tribes indigenous tribes in Indonesia. Why is the human brain so different? Why are we so different? Ornstein argues it gives us that extra capacity now to make sense of ourselves and reflect on ourselves. Understanding the context, then, this is the general theme today, out of which our biological embodiment has evolved, can help our self-right realization in the direction of being, transcendence, and freedom. That's the perspective I'm arguing, really. But again, it's about working with how things are, which I guess is a point David Frazier mentioned. It's about being how things are, rather than how we would like them to be. An interesting thing, according to what I was reading in Badcock's book, is that mammals begin with a female body plan. And that's really interesting, I think, which is why males have nipples, if you've ever wondered. And some males can express milk, apparently, which is actually a carefully guarded secret by males through thousands of years, so we don't have to get up in the middle of the night. But this is and there's an interesting idea then that evolution is not for necessarily perfect design. There are design flaws in evolution and nature. Nipples in humans, maybe a design flaw, maybe it's not. Maybe it's kind of, a blueprint. A lot of the transpersonal implications of this. And my experience of a divine feminine, such as it is whether my experience, and Tara here from Tibetan Buddhism, there's a picture coming up, that's why it's like that. A beautiful Tanka picture of Tara, Chitamana Tara. The divine feminine is the ground of all being, and I think it's just really interesting that the basic mammalian body plan is female. And males are a deviation from it. So you can argue it from any perspective you like, can't you? You can say, extra, or deviations from how things should be. And Tara is often regarded as the mother of the Buddhas. And Prajnaparamita, the deity associated with the Heart Sutra, is also a female figure, and a very beautiful figure. So I just find that interesting, because to me, my experiences in this area is you kind of get to some sort of infinite ground in my unrealized experience of the world, which just is infinite, and it feels female to me. It feels feminine. It does to me anyway. And I didn't know about that body plan thing, female body plan, basic design. So we come, thanks to the promotions of what is Enlightenment, who spotted our conference, sort of a Sauron-like eye kind of beamed round to say, right. And I found it really interesting. And so they sent me flyers and sent me 2 copies on gender, as it happened. One was devoted to what it is to be a woman and what it is to be a man. One's current, a current one actually, and one came out about a year ago. Andrew Cohen then, the editor of this view, no, not so bad. He argues, so this is an offering to think about. The whole thing is just something to think about, that's all. Maybe men and women face different challenges to going beyond the ego. And I think this is an interesting question. And again, they always make a proviso that it doesn't apply to everybody. It's not trying to fit people into boxes, but there is a kind of spectrum maybe. Presumably you could be a male at the female end and vice versa, but it's an interesting question to consider, and some of it you may not like. So blame whoever you like. But you might do. He's interested in spiritual development and evolution of culture. And these are just ideas. It was a discussion between Wilbur and Cohen. He reckons in his experience, I don't know Andrew Cohen directly, do you, Rosemary? No. Women and men respond very differently. He said he was only ever interested in being a spiritual teacher, but he's found in his experience, I don't know if it's mainly with American people. I know he does work over here. He mentions workshops in Spain. But in his experience, he feels that there are differences in how men and women, a bit like Rob's exploration of how people connect with the teaching psychologically. Andrew Cohen suggests that maybe men and women, or males and females, respond differently. This I don't know, but this is what's said, so I'll pass it on to chew on it, or to spit it out, or to whatever you want to do. I'm not sure about this statement, but then it's what his experience is. He explored, because he's interested in the social context of enlightenment. What would it mean to relate to others transpersonally? And he found, you're really not going to like this, that men found it relatively easy to take on board, which I'm not absolutely sure about. That was his experience, whereas women didn't. Whereas he said, even though women, the argument being, from evolutionary psychology, is that women are more primed to tune into others. And that basic reality of having to care for a baby. And Wilbur mentions a bit further down the line here, that when a woman has a baby, then, and I saw it with my daughter, there is this adoration, isn't there? There's this adoration. But also, if you think about it in evolutionary terms, there's this micro-inspection and awareness of any micro little change. And I've seen that in my daughter. In fact, I've seen it a number of times with my own former spouse. How women change. My experience is that women change overnight, can change overnight when they actually have a baby. And Wilbur argues that things kick in, And I was talking to one female colleague, evolutionary psychology colleague, and she said, and it's because you're a mother, you have to do it. It's what you have to do. That's why you stay up all night, and you have to do it. And something enables you to do that. What he's suggesting, and it's just a thought, and you don't need to take it seriously, or you can, is that he found the women he was working with, so I'm always trying to qualify this, in his experience found just being was difficult. Just being was difficult. Not being with someone, being open to someone, or being intimate with someone, but just being was difficult. I've got a lot of material to get through, so I'm going to have to whip through it, even though it may be controversial to you. He experienced that there's a profound sense of panic in just being. Pure being. And what Cohen argues, which it may also may not like, it suggests that maybe there is a vulnerability, a biological vulnerability, which is kind of built in from a female point of view, which may not be part of male experience. Now this relates to some of my friendships, deep women friends. But the argument here is that maybe females have to develop ways to protect themselves that were not physical. With my granddaughter, I was saying with Hara, my very limited experience of little boys and little girls, is that so often I see little girls sussing out a situation, weighing up the probabilities. Maybe it's just the genetic, which Martin told me, I've obviously come from a completely mad family when we were having a meal last night. Whereas my experience of little boys is that they tend to jump into things, which is more precarious. What they're suggesting, what Cohen is suggesting, is that the ego structure or self-structure in women may be a more elaborate defense mechanism out of necessity. These are just thoughts, just things to consider. And I've only just picked them up a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. Because it's a means to self-protect. And again, you put yourself in that position of a woman giving birth in the savannah, right? Just think what you have to do. I've got a woman friend who escaped from one partner, the biological father of her 3 children, and immediately she found herself in her 30s with 3 very young children, like my daughter, who's in her 20s, actually, late 20s. What do you do? And she said, my instinct was a tigress instinct. I looked for a protector. I looked for a guy who had lots of money. And she got one. She's an attractive woman. She got one, which has created a whole host of secondary problems. But it also makes sense, I think. You see, it always fascinated me as a student at Liverpool why it was the bastards who always got the most gorgeous girls. And there's something, it's a regular thing. So helping, now that makes sense. There's an evolutionary perspective on that, isn't there? On mate selection. In fact, my colleague, she's not here, my colleague, she did not make a good choice in that area, which prompted her to study evolutionary psychology at the Open University. Because what she wants to understand is, why the hell did I make such a stupid choice? And it starts to make sense in evolutionary psychology terms, perhaps. So there are I find this interesting because it contributes to our understanding of ourselves. Also, it contributes to our understanding of ourselves in working in a therapeutic way with others, but also in terms of making sense of ourselves. That's John Crook argues in his book. As humans, we're curious we're always trying to make sense of ourselves. Anyway, so they have this, what Cohen and Wilbur, because they're big on authenticity, about being authentic. There are, he suggests, maybe women have particular, I think men have also got big difficulties as well. Anyway, I've got to really crack on here. Women learn early in life how to keep themselves emotionally and psychologically safe, is the perspective. Now this is where I come in. And there's an inner place of retreat where she cannot be reached, which, according to Cohen, so I don't agree with this necessarily, but it could be an evolutionary adaptation to protect one's soul, even if one's physically overwhelmed. Again, think of the reality of being a woman in that kind of more primal setting. But on that logic, I'm definitely a girl, because I've always done that. There's this argument that women are primed to try and fit in, are so good at fitting into settings. And this idea that men are relatively more simple, straightforward. So the suggestion there is that maybe, in terms of going beyond the ego, maybe women have more to lose, there's more to let go of. But, which were originally born out of biological necessity. So we're not modern. The point here is that most of the life of our species in this planet is not in this setting. That's the context here, really. And think what it was like, what it must have been like. There's a series called Tribe. Did you ever see it? I'm glad Ingrid's come back. And I found it really interesting. And there was a tribe in Kenya. It was this English, I think it was an English guy, went around living with various tribes, you see. And he went to this Kenyan one. I'm so glad Ingrid's come back in. So there was a headman of the village. But there's this woman ran the show. And she was always laughing. And she reminded me of Ingrid. And she was always laughing. She knew everybody. She was the power source of the village. Also, you could tell she quite fancied this guy who'd come trolling into the village. Said, "Oh, you can sleep in my hut," sort of thing. And she'd start. It's called Mark Nesty. No, it was. And she would feed him, literally feed him, put stuff in his mouth. But what was so interesting was the total interdependence of the sexes, of the genders. Because you realise what the women needed. If you've got, bringing up children, what do you need? So you need... And so the men, as in Greg LaHood, the Australian chap, in his presentations, men were integrally involved in childbirth, in providing and so on, because it had to work together. And that's what struck me in that series, is how interdependent people were, in a very primary way, and it all seemed kind of to make sense to me. Recognise that men are terrified of transcending their own ego, but the suggestion is it's different. I might actually... There's this idea then, from a female perspective, if I let go of my ego, I'm physically going to die. If I transcend my ego, I have no way to protect myself. The suggestion then is that emptiness may be, these are just suggestions, and the idea is to offer suggestions, not to present any view, because I don't have one. It may be more threatening to females than males, that's just a thought. It may be, and of course it may not be, or it may be totally different, or irrelevant. Also, if you're going beyond your ego, then about identification with sexual power is an interesting... Again, I have women friends who tell me, we've discussed this with. Anyway, apparently his students have now achieved this great level. They've cracked it, so all is well. So there's a happy end, and it happened in Spain about a year ago. And they're having a great time. And of course, as we all know, in the Wilber models and so on, at the higher levels of an authentic self and higher waves of development, the biological universals of gender are dropped, which is brilliant. And the present times are obviously much more conducive. Here, Wilber's argument about why you had patriarchal societies and so on. Feminists being uncomfortable with evolutionary psychology. Right. So, we come to... One interesting view from Wilber is that he thinks that men perhaps relate more easily to freedom and maybe women to fullness, which is probably not going down very well either. Anyway, I'm not, you don't have years of training, to avoid these things. This idea that men are primed more for autonomy rather than interaction because of biology. That's the point about a woman's biology primes her to be tuned to every emotion to that of a child. I mean, if you ever were given a job description of what it is to be a parent, the species would have died out 1 million years ago, wouldn't it? Because nothing matches it as far as I'm... Obviously things do match it, but really the basic is, there is very little, I think, which matches it. We're going to talk about transcending biological structures and so on, but they're deeply buried, and I do think this is spirituality, that is a fact. I just think, as a thought in the middle, I've only got a few minutes to go, is not birth and motherhood the perfect practice of going beyond the individual isolated self? And I'm very curious about why it is so under-recognised. And it's really weird. If you stand back from it, the whole thing is weird. At 61, the whole thing strikes me as increasingly weird. but I'm from a mad family, according to Martin. So, and the act of giving birth, because I've seen it, I'd forgotten all about this, you see, for a quarter of a century. The act of giving, until my grandchildren appeared, the act of giving birth and caring for 24 hours every day for a totally helpless human baby, to me it's the most complete spiritual act. And I really can't think of anything, obviously you can think of caring for someone with Alzheimer's or someone who's very ill, or the way Ingrid cares for us. And it's a blueprint anyway for all of us. And Dalai Lama mentioned that. He mentioned about compassion and perhaps that women are able to access it. Again, this is not about divisions. It's about actually looking at ourselves to go beyond, not divisions, but characteristics. So I do feel that very, very strongly, increasingly. Oh yeah, a book I love very much is The Great Bliss Queen. You familiar with Rosemary? By Anne Caroline Klein. Do you know Anne? Do you know her, Rob? She's a very experienced practitioner like yourself, but she's also a very much a pioneer in America of feminist thought. And The Great Bliss Queen links the two together. So she's a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, doing a lot of retreats in the Himalayas. And she introduced a very interesting idea because, what you can't talk about or agree with your feminist friends. So Lisa, when we both gave our presentations, we were both wearing skirts last year on transgender and spirituality. What my feminist colleagues and friends don't like at all is the idea of anything essentialist. And what is interesting from Anne Klein's point of view is that exactly the experiences you are describing are what she's experienced as people do, if you follow that path, I think. And she says, well, you can be non-essentialist in terms of, conditioned gender, identity, and all the rest of it. But you can also discover a kind of unified source. So she argues that this sort of contemplative practice actually offers something to feminism, feminist thought, because you're deconstructing the self, if you like, if you look at it from that point of view, but you discover something kind of more universal or fundamental, which of course, and it's at a different level. And so she argues that women in women in history are not as experienced of their individuation as men, and men have had to be individuated to go and kind of function in the world and get a crust or bring a crust back. And she argues that the Great Bliss Queen herself, which is a very familiar Tibetan deity, or a symbol for various Tibetan female deities, holds and expresses infinite multiplicities, and at the same time offers a dynamic of coherence. So you've got this experience, whilst deconstructing everything in the postmodern way, you discover actually a root, a source. See what I mean? So the process of deconstructing the individual brings you to something which is fundamental and kind of absolute in a non-absolute sort of way. See what I mean? So it's very interesting. What she calls a dynamic of coherence. And the coherence lies not in a unifying narrative, which is where the transpersonal can offer so much to contemporary thought, I think. She says it's a dynamic of clarified attention. It's the clarified attention which Rob so wonderfully demonstrated, which actually brings you something, accesses something which is more fundamental and unified than merely deconstructing. Because the risk of deconstruction, obviously, as Buddhism has been aware for a long time, is the risk of nihilism. Whereas the true contemplative practice, as Rob described, as experienced and others, I'm sure, is something much more fundamental and much more rooted, but is a product of attention, is a product of clarified attention. So which comes back to John Crook's argument that there are different modes of consciousness built into our biology. So, this is the one point, this is where I was going to get into agenda stuff. I'm going to have to finish, really. Maybe leave it for another time. For young, I spend most of my working life, which is perhaps why I haven't retired yet, is spent listening to young women. Because most psychology students are female, and they talk to you. And I love talking to people from different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, and so on. And they don't. And there is some truth in this. There is, for a young woman born nowadays, there isn't. They can't really understand how it was in the 1950s, any more than us grammar school lads from Manchester, have any appreciation of what it was like for our fathers' generation to have to leave school at 14. I didn't really. I knew it, and I still know it, but I don't know it. I don't know what it's like to have to leave school at 14 because your father's died of wounds from the last war and go out and support the family because you're the only source of revenue because you're the male. Or you're sent off to war. We talked about that. And that's only 2 generations, another generation back. It's very recent. So it is understandable why... Oh, yeah. That's right. Another thing... I'm going to have to finish, aren't I, Ingrid? I'll finish on this note. So I haven't got into all the gender stuff, the examples, because I wanted to get onto male experience, really, in the modern world. But in Manchester, my parents had a shop where people like George Best and Dennis Law, if you're into football, and the cast of Coronation Street used to come in, you see. So Mum thought it was all a documentary. If you remember Cell Block H, she's convinced that's a documentary. For the Australians amongst you, who've seen Australian television. Yeah, it was on British television for years. No, but yeah, so it was all kind of all real, on television, telly was real. Anyway, and you often hear women saying then, it's a bloody man's world, isn't it? Bloody man's world. Next time I'm coming back, there's a man. And I don't hear that so much nowadays. Pardon?
Correct.
Sorry?
You don't hear it.
And that's interesting. So on that note, as Ingrid left you wanting more, and left you wanting more on the first night of the entertainment, I'll leave it on that note. So I'll have to finish there.